Today, we're going to dive into a topic that's so often wrapped up in silence but has, well, just devastating consequences. We're going to talk about the quiet epidemic of male loneliness and suicide right here in India.
You know, it so often starts with a phrase that I bet many of us in India have heard a million times growing up. Mard ko rona nahi chahiye. Men shouldn't cry. It sounds simple, right? But that one sentence, it's the bedrock of this rigid code of masculinity. One that teaches boys from day one to just swallow their emotions and put on a brave face no matter what.
Okay, so keep that thought in your head for a second, and now look at this number, 118,979. It's a huge, staggering figure, and it represents a hidden national tragedy.
That's what this number is. It's the number of men who died by suicide in India in just a single year, 2021. And listen, this is not just a statistic. It's a massive public health crisis that we just don't talk about enough, a silent epidemic unfolding right under our noses.
And when you dig into the data, you find this absolutely shocking gender gap. The suicide rate for men is more than 2.5 times higher than for women. So the big question is why? What is driving this devastating trend?
So, let's start peeling back the layers. Let's look at the story behind these numbers, a crisis that's truly hidden in plain sight.
To really get to the bottom of this, we've got to go all the way back to the beginning to see how this silence gets built, right from the time they're just little kids.
This is really the question we need to unpack, isn't it? What happens when that little boy who was told to be tough grows into a man who is suddenly expected to carry the weight of the entire world on his shoulders? That journey, that's where the roots of this crisis are.
You know, there's actually a term for this process. Researchers call it gender straitjacketing. It's this idea that from a really young age, boys are kind of forced into this cultural straitjacket that pretty much chokes off their emotional expression and enforces this super narrow idea of what it means to be a man.
And this isn't something that happens when you're a teenager. No, this conditioning starts incredibly early. Research shows there's this unwritten boy code taught to boys as young as 3 to 5 years old. And the rules are simple. 1, push down any sadness. 2, be tough. 3, if you do show emotion, you should be ashamed. And 4, the big one, vulnerability is weakness. Period. And Dr. Shubham Vatsya just captures this experience so perfectly. He talks about his childhood, and the message was just crystal clear. You're crying, I can't. Tears are not for boys. So the lesson he learned, the lesson so many learn, is a dangerous one. Vulnerability is weakness. And that idea gets drilled in until it's a core part of who you are. All right, so next up, let's see how this childhood conditioning just explodes in adulthood. Because those early lessons, they don't just go away, they get way more intense and get mixed up with a whole new world of pressures. Researchers have a really powerful way to describe this, the pressure cooker. And it makes so much sense, right? If you just keep bottling up all these emotions with no safe way to let off steam, they don't just disappear, they transform. They can curdle into anger, hostility, or, so tragically, violence that's turned inward at yourself. And on top of that emotional lockdown, you start piling on all these modern pressures. The enormous weight of being the sole provider, the constant economic anxiety, the corporate hustle culture that never sleeps, and this intense pressure to measure your entire worth by your material success.
Dr. Vatsya shared this one story that's, well, it's pretty shocking and tells you everything. During a first meeting for a potential marriage, the very first question wasn't about who he was as a person. It was about his assets. What is the rental income in the son's name? That just shows you the crushing, materialistic yardstick men are so often measured against.
So, you mix this emotional suppression with all that external pressure, and you get a devastating result. You end up feeling completely alone, even in a crowd. Let's look at the direct consequences of this lifelong silence.
This quote? Wow, it just gets right to the heart of that internal feeling. When men can't talk about their pain, they just retreat inward. Loneliness becomes a shield, a defense mechanism. But it often leads to total isolation and some really unhealthy ways of coping. It's a quiet suffering that just festers in the dark.
And you can actually see one of those coping mechanisms right here in the data. The percentage of male suicides linked to addiction has jumped like crazy, from just over 1% back in 1995 to almost 9% in 2021. Substance abuse becomes a way to numb the pain, but of course, it usually just makes the crisis so much deeper.
And tragically, when men do hit that breaking point, their attempts are often much more lethal. You can see it in the table. Men are more likely to use methods like pesticide poisoning, which has a fatality rate of over 70%, while the methods more commonly used by women often have lower fatality rates.
So ultimately, it's just this vicious, tragic cycle. The conditioning to be stoic creates a total emotional lockdown. That lockdown stops men from reaching out for help, so they just endure their pain in silence, isolated and alone, often until it's just too late.
Okay, that was a lot, and it's heavy stuff, I know. But, and this is a really important but, this is not an unsolvable problem. So let's shift gears now. Let's talk about the path forward and how we can start to break this destructive cycle of silence. Before we jump to solutions, though, we have to be real about the hurdles. There's still a massive stigma around mental health in our country. Key laws are often way too slow to be put into practice. And maybe most critically, there's a serious lack of community support and truly safe spaces where men feel they can finally, let their guard down and be vulnerable. So the solutions have to come from all sides. It's not just one thing. We absolutely need to promote government programs like the Tele-MANAS helpline. We need something called gatekeeper training to help family, friends, and coworkers spot the warning signs. But just as important, we need a huge cultural shift. We need to build social circles where showing emotion is seen as a sign of strength, not weakness.
And let's be absolutely clear about this. Supporting men's mental health is not charity. It is a fundamental, vital step toward building a healthier, stronger, more inclusive society for every single one of us. Because when men are healthier, families get healthier, and entire communities get healthier.
So I'll just leave you with this question to think about. I know this is a massive societal issue, but change always starts small. So how can we, in our own lives, with our friends, our brothers, our dads, our sons, how can we start to break the silence and create spaces where it's finally okay for men not to be okay?